get started where we're at. So again, I'd like to welcome everyone today for our COSA Shop Talk webinar. Today, we're going to be talking with Amy Rudersdorf from AVP. So Amy, go ahead and go to the next slide real quick. We'll just talk about what we're going to do today. We're just going to have a presentation. We'll have a chance for question and answers at the end, and then announcements. So as you think of your questions throughout, if you want to go to type them down in chat as you're thinking of them, we'll collect them and then we'll try and answer them at the end. So go ahead, Amy. And Amy's going to be our presenter today, and I'm going to let her introduce herself here in just a minute. And I think we're ready to go.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, so much for the opportunity to speak today. For those of you that are SERI members, some of you heard from me a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to talk about something completely different today. So stick with me. This is an introduction to digital preservation maturity assessments, DIY and DPGo. So DPGo is short for Digital Preservation Go. It's one of AVP's newest services, and I'll talk a little bit about it towards the end after I give you an overview of how to actually perform your own digital preservation maturity assessment. So a little bit about me. I am a senior consultant with AVP. As I mentioned, I live in Madison, Wisconsin. I've been performing assessments and other digital preservation related work, technology selection, technology implementation for about 6 years with AVP. Prior to that, I worked at the Digital Public Library of America and the State Library of North Carolina. So I'm not a state archivist, but I am familiar with state libraries, and I know that there's a lot of overlap in ways and some uniqueness between the two as well. And I've also worked in academic institutions in the Southern and Midwestern United States. In all of these positions, I've managed digital collections and digital preservation projects and programs. So I think I have a little bit of experience to talk to you today about digital preservation maturity assessments. And as I mentioned, I work for AVP. AVP is an information innovation firm. We offer consulting and software development services to help organizations transform how they protect, manage, and use data and digital assets. We aren't strangers to the digital preservation community. As I mentioned, I come from that world. And in fact, most of our digital preservation consultants come straight from the cultural heritage world. And the benefit of us being both a software development and consulting company is that we can provide a soup to nuts approach. So we can help you define your goals. And then if you want, we can also help you take the next steps to actually achieve those goals through technology selection, migration of data, any sort of data manipulation you might need. We can help with that as well. Our goal is really to help you achieve your goals. And we do this with honesty and a commitment to inclusivity and excellence. And I like to highlight this slide because I think we're different than a lot of companies in that we really do have a commitment to honesty and integrity and social consciousness as well. These are a couple of the types of clients we work with. What you don't see on here are any government agencies, but we do work with government agencies as well. I'm working with a county government in California right now personally, and we've done work with state libraries and state archives as well. So that's AVP, and now I'm going to jump into the presentation. So this is a quote that I love. I use it all the time. I'm going to use it here. I'll read it out first of all, and it says, "A flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance." And I always start with this quote because we're talking about digital preservation today. And ultimately, digital preservation is about maintenance. It's not about the new and innovative next thing down the pike. It's about steady practicality. Within that practicality, there may be moments of innovation, like updated tools or maybe new schools of thought, but those are folded into our day-to-day management practices. right? We as a community that is managing digital content over the long term, our goal is to keep that data as stable and as authentic as possible. And so we need to create systems that focus on the maintenance of those assets. We don't want to be changing those assets. We just want them to be stable in a maintenance environment. Maintenance is not something you do once and walk away from, as you know. Maintenance is a long road, and the challenge is that changes are happening on both sides of the road as you move down it. And so you have to keep your eye on the horizon, right? Periodically, you're going to need to check and assess how you're doing, fill the tank up with gas, and then go through the process of updating or improving your processes to ensure that you're doing the best you can for your assets. But ultimately, this is a long road. We're headed for the horizon, and we never quite meet that horizon. And that's, thinking about the idea that preservation is forever. We know that forever is undefined. We don't really know how long our assets will be maintainable for, but we're going to do our best to do that. We're going to keep aiming for the horizon. Okay, so this is what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about digital preservation maturity assessments. I'm going to walk you through how you can do it yourself. And then I'm going to talk about our service, Digital Preservation Go, and how you might consider that as an alternative based on a few things that I'll talk about as we go through. So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to assume I'm at the point, and I think we all are generally at the point that we understand what digital preservation is, even if it's just in an abstract sense. So I'm not going to go over digital preservation terminology. What I am going to say is that a maturity assessment is performed to identify for system or for programs that exist, any gaps in your program, any challenges that you face, and also highlighting your successes. So you don't want to go through a process and hear all about the things you're doing wrong. Nobody wants to hear about that. So we want to make sure that as we're doing these assessments, we're really highlighting our successes as well, because we're going to be communicating to our stakeholders, and we don't want to go to them and say, look at all these things we're not doing right. We want to say to them, here are the challenges, here's where we're challenged, but we're also doing these things well, so you can trust us. And the fact that we're doing this assessment is just another step towards that trustworthiness. So the goal of a digital preservation assessment is to improve processes, policies, governance, and workflows. What you're not seeing in this list here is technology. Technology is important. Technology is how we actually store and ensure the integrity of our files. But so much of digital preservation is wrapped up in the people and the processes. And I want you to keep that in mind. I think that's the biggest struggle that people have, is that the answer to your digital preservation needs is not exclusively technology. And if you look at a lot of the standards out there, they point to organizational infrastructure as just as important as the technology. If you don't have your policies and your people in place, you can't do the work to maintain your content and the technology your content lives in. Okay, so why do we do this digital preservation assessment? Well, I'd like to think of it as sort of a wellness journey. You're going to try to be as mindful as you can about your collections as you're going through this process, and implementing other wellness techniques to ensure that you're gaining an understanding of what you're really doing today. You need to be very honest with yourself and honest with whomever is involved in this assessment to make sure that you're truly understanding what's happening today so that you can set real goals for your future, and then figure out how to meet those goals. And then you definitely want to, just like if you go to a fabulous spa, you want to share that journey. You want to share what you've learned with anyone that'll listen to you. In this, with your technology, with your digital preservation maturity assessment, the ultimate goal really is how do you update and fix any issues you have, but also how do you build buy-in? How do you communicate out to people that you are truly managing a program as effectively, as efficiently, as stably as you can? And this tool, this maturity assessment, can help you do that. Like I said, we do it to address gaps and challenges in current practice and to understand where your program is today. What's the current status of your repository? I keep saying gaps, challenges, and successes. That's really the key. You want to understand where you want to go. So out of this maturity assessment, you're going to set goals. You're going to align with best practices. You may be doing things well, but you may not be aligning with best practices. And a maturity assessment should help you do that. And then this assessment should also help you identify internal factors influencing any decision-making, either for you or for others within your organization that may have more administrative sort of control over your program. And then the other key piece of this is not just setting goals, but figuring out how to reach those goals. So what resources will it take to achieve the goals you've set from box 2? How do you prioritize those goals? And how do you figure out how long it will take? So those are the ultimate sort of outputs of your digital preservation maturity assessment. Okay, so there are a lot of assessment tools on the landscape, and I am not listing them all here, and you may know of others that aren't here, and I could probably make a slide with twice as many, but these are some of the big ones that people talk about. And I've given you a little bit of information about them. You'll see at the bottom I've put vendor assessment, and I am a vendor, so I want to make sure that you're thinking about us as well. We like to think that the complexity working with a vendor is actually going to be lower than if you have to do it yourself. But not all of these DIY tools are very high complexity. Some of them are lower. So if you look at something like NEDCC's peer assessment, where you work with another organization to do an assessment of one another's organization, that tends to be a relatively low complexity tool. So it might be something that you want to consider. Right out of the gate, you definitely don't want to attack the ISO standard for trustworthy digital repositories. Very complex, extremely holistic, but probably not your first step. You may know about the NDSA levels of preservation. I love that tool. It's a great tool. The only caveat is that it doesn't address your organizational infrastructure. It only addresses technical issues. So you're kind of only getting half of what you need to know out of that assessment to do a real sort of more holistic, get a more holistic view of your program. So what should you expect from your maturity assessment? So if you're doing this yourself, there are some real, you're going to have to put some time and some work into this. It can be resource intensive, and it's not only for your digital preservation staff, but if you're going to be interviewing other stakeholders, which we'll talk about in a second, they'll need to be brought in, and that might include your administration, maybe IT staff. You're going to be doing a deep analysis of your tools, services, workflows, policies, processes, anything you have, finances, so that you understand, again, what your situation is today, so that you can grow a program from it that does the best it can for your digital assets. You're going to need to have honest discussions. I say that every time I talk to clients. We have to be honest. I am a neutral third party, so it's easy for people to be honest. That might be a challenge that you have in your organization, depending on the dynamics within your organization. So you need to be willing to both take and receive constructive criticism. And then you're going to need to spend time documenting your outcomes. This is, if you were in my policy presentation a couple of weeks ago, you know that I'm all about documenting. And if you're going to spend the time to go through this process, you need to really document your outcomes, especially because it's part of maintenance. You're going to come back and do this assessment again in a year or 3 years, and you need to be able to reference where you're starting from at that point. And the documentation that comes out of this assessment is going to help you do that. Okay, so this is what's going to happen during your assessment. We're going to do a documentation review. We're going to do discovery, and I'll talk about what that means, gap analysis, recommendations, reporting, and road mapping. So this is your checklist. If you get through this whole process, you'll have a great document in your hands that's going to help you take your next steps to grow your preservation program. So the first thing we're going to do when performing a self-assessment is choose a tool. And I'm going back to this slide. Again, this is the same thing you're seeing here. I've dropped DPGo in at the bottom. This is the tool I'll be talking about later, but it is also something that you could use to do this assessment as well. It's not a self-assessment, although there is a big chunk of it that involves your work to do some of this self-reflection. Okay, that was easy. You chose a tool. Now you're going to gather documentation. You want to get all of the documentation about your program, about that your institution that influences your program. Just get it all together and read through that documentation so that you really understand what the documented policies are, how workflows work, whether they're documented, how your planning is happening, who's involved in planning. Just getting a really clear understanding of what's happening. And it's nice to go through the process of bringing all this documentation together, not just for the maturity assessment, but also then you have it in one place as you move forward. Again, it's all about building your program so that you can take the next steps forward. So co-locating all of this information is sort of a secret step in making that happen. So you're going to look at policies and planning documents, workflows, process documents, infrastructure and tech diagrams. If your IT department has tech diagrams, it's always really good to just take a look at them, even if they might make your eyes bleed a little bit. They're useful to see. Program reports and directives. And I like to, when I talk to a client, I like to see their org charts so I can understand how people are reporting to people, so we know who we need to be talking to as far as stakeholders and administrative folks go, to make sure that we're getting all the voices, we're hearing all the voices we need to hear. All right, you've gathered your documentation. We are 2 steps out of 6 through our self-assessment. The next one is really a big chunk of what you're going to do, and this is what we call discovery. You could bring that documentation and those materials and bring those into your discovery process and kind of call them all one thing. But I think it's important to delineate them because this part of discovery is really about talking to people. So it's nice to gather your documentation, read your documentation so that you've educated yourself before you talk to your stakeholders. So you understand what they know, or you have a sense of what they know, what they've been involved with up to this point, etc. So I like this quote. This is what you're going to be doing next. If you're doing a self-assessment, now if it's just you and you're the only person in your program and you don't have an administrator and there's no IT staff, obviously you're not going to interview people. But anyone who's a stakeholder, anyone who might create, deliver, use, fund, administer anything related to digital preservation objects should probably be talked to, just to make sure that you're understanding what their challenges might be, what their questions might be, which may inform some of your thinking around gaps and challenges, and also where they see that you're doing a great job. Again, this isn't about all of your failures. This is about understanding the status and what you're doing well and where you can improve. So listening is not understanding the words of the question asked. Listening is understanding why the question was asked in the first place. So this is, when you're talking to people, there's sort of you want to make sure that both of these things are happening. You're asking questions, but you're also listening, really hearing how people are answering those questions, because sometimes people, and I mean, if you've had a conversation in your life, that not always, you're not always going to get the most direct answer. And so you need to really be listening to hear what those answers truly are. So as you interview your colleagues and decision makers and users, listen well with openness and acceptance. Your goal is to understand challenges and gaps, not to illustrate what your institution is doing wrong, but to identify what needs improvement and maintenance. So try really hard not to go into meetings with perceptions that may cloud how you listen and what you hear. Okay, so again, discovery is really face-to-face meetings. We call them interviews when we do them ourselves. And we sit down with a variety of stakeholders within an organization, and we ask them these types of questions. So you will get a copy of these slides, so you'll get the questions. I'm not going to read all of them. The print is small, but I really wanted to make sure that you could see the kinds of things that you should be asking to get the information you need to understand your program better, or the people's perceptions of your program. So for creators and collectors, you want to understand digitization workflows. If you're talking about digitized materials, you want to understand how materials are accessioned into an archive. If they're born digital, at what point are they is fixity being checked? If it's being checked, what types of metadata needs to be created and stored with your assets? What aren't you creating today that maybe would help you with your maintenance plans? When you talk to administration, you want to understand what things like guiding principles for current and future digital collections and digital preservation systems. So you may have an idea of where you want to go, but does it align with your administration? That misalignment can be a real problem if you don't address it early. Vision, understanding vision and alignment there. Hearing from administration what they think the pain points are for the work you're doing. Maybe they're seeing a struggle with how materials are being accessed, and so that would be something that you'd want to address in the assessment. And then ask your administration what sort of support they have for staffing and professional development, or if funding increases might be on their horizon, and how long is that horizon? Is it a year or 5 years? Those are all things that are going to influence your goals and your roadmap. And then you're definitely going to want to talk to IT, because, as I mentioned, a big chunk of what you do in digital preservation is technology dependent. And so understanding IT's understanding IT's understanding of what you do is always really important. I know that when I worked in state government, IT did not understand digital preservation as a concept. Now, it's been several years since I was working at the state library in North Carolina, and I'm sure things have changed. But like getting on the same page with all of these stakeholders is really important. If you find that you're not on the same page, then clearly one of your goals is to figure out how to improve communications. Talking to IT about storage, the types of storage that they use, how they back up your files, because IT can have very different understanding of what backup means than you might. They may look at incremental backups, so just backing up changes as opposed to full redundant backups of your materials, 2 or 3 copies that are unchanged over time. It's a very different concept than what business, sort of standard IT business backup looks like. Understanding from them what kind of storage they'll be purchasing in the future, and maybe getting on their getting on their radar for storage that you're going to need in the future. Finding out from them how they do fixity. Do they perform fixity? Would they perform fixity? Those kinds of questions. All of that's really important. That's going to really inform this assessment. And I could talk about these questions all day, but I think this gives you a good sense and hopefully will help to spur you to think of other questions that are equally as important and relevant. All right, you've done the discovery, you've asked the questions, you've taken notes. So that's something I want to mention is, in my experience, people are much more comfortable if you're taking notes during a discovery interview than if you're recording it. Some people might not mind, but some people do. And what I've found is that people are much more open and are much more honest if they're not being recorded. So if you're going to do interviews, if you can get somebody to go into that interview with you who can just sit there and take notes, it's invaluable. I have done assessments where I've had to take notes and interview people at the same time, and it's really, really hard. So if you can, get a team member to help you with that. All right, you've got all your documentation. You've got the results of all of those interviews. So what do you do with it? So this is sort of how we analyze discovery interviews and documentation. We will go through, once we've done the interviews, we've organized them all, we're going to go through and read them and start to pull out important points that we see over and over again. So we may find that someone mentions metadata. And so we may color code metadata green. And then throughout all the documentation and throughout all the interviews, anytime someone mentions metadata, we color it green. And now we can start to see where there's repeated points that start to help us prioritize issues or concerns. So if everybody mentions that the metadata that is being created is not useful, you've just identified a problem that you need to address. So we find it's just a really easy way. You have to review those notes anyway, review them with a goal in mind, and color code makes it easy to skim through at a later date. Once you've mapped all these relevant findings to these color codes, you can start to dedupe and synthesize. And I kind of alluded to that with the metadata example. So there's going to be duplicates when two people say the same thing. Dedupe and synthesize those responses. Start to create statements that represent what those people are saying. So it might be the metadata that's captured is not sufficient for users to download, whatever it might be. So that if someone's saying the same thing, if several people are saying the same thing, it's highlighting a concern or a challenge. And so you want to pull that out, and you can start to create a list of your challenges. You can kind of see where we're headed with this. And then you're going to begin to identify your gaps. So once you've synthesized all the findings and mapped them, you can score your results to identify gaps and successes. Your recommendations will be based on the gaps you've identified. And so if you're using a tool like NDSA, there are literally boxes that you can color code and start to see, oh, metadata is an issue. I'm going to color this red. It's an issue. I'm only at a level 1 with NDSA. I need to address that. And if you don't know what NDSA is, I apologize. Don't worry about it. Okay, so you've analyzed your results, and now you need to document your findings so that you can start to put together your recommendations. So I'm actually showing you a couple of examples of how you can document your findings. So the first one is a worksheet that's created by the Digital Preservation Coalition, and it's part of their rapid assessment model. So this is one of those tools that's a DIY, and you can do it yourself. answer some questions. You can do some self-scoring and get a sense of where your gaps might be. This is actually the tool that we've based DPGo on. So what you're seeing there is actually, we use this worksheet as part of our final deliverables. So what you do is you can see organizational viability. You're going to answer questions around governance, organizational structure, staffing, and resourcing of digital preservation activities. You're going to fill out your evidence that supports where you feel like you are, and then there is a scoring model that's built into RAM, and you give yourself a score. So this is one way to document the results of your research. Another way would be to write a report. So if we do a larger scale assessment, so DPGo is our smallest service, it's our lowest cost and sort of least hands-on from a consultant perspective. But if you did a larger assessment, one of our more expensive assessments, but more built out, we'll actually write a report outlining what your gaps and what your current state is, and the gaps and the successes we see. And we write some recommendations in that report. And we'll look at things like ISO 16363, which is, I mentioned, is the international standard for trustworthy digital repositories, and reference some of these tools to support the findings that we see. It's really going to depend on your stakeholders, how you present your results. So if it makes sense for your team to just fill out a worksheet and just do some simple notation, then maybe something like the DPC RAM is the way to go. If you feel like your administration needs a document that really clarifies all of the findings, why you've come to the point that you've come to, then maybe you need to write a report. And it doesn't have to be a 60-page report. It might be a 5-page report, but just something that you can hand to someone to show them, again, we are a program. We're not just a project within the archive. We're approaching this from a programmatic perspective. And here is an example of how that's happening. And with something like a formal document that you've drafted to present these findings. But again, to gain, you can see in my reminder there, to gain buy-in, document your findings in a way that communicates best to your decision makers. So don't hand them a 10-page report if they're not going to read it. Okay, so you've documented your results. Now you're going to build a roadmap. When I say roadmap, basically what I'm saying is a list of your recommendations. So you've come up with your findings, and you're going to build recommendations from these findings. So if you find that your metadata is incomplete for long-term preservation, maybe you're not collecting preservation metadata, then one of your recommendations is going to be collect preservation metadata, whatever that preservation metadata might be. So you're going to create this list of recommendations for yourself. I also strongly suggest you create a list of your successes, so places where you feel like you're doing a good job, and you put both of those in whatever documentation you present to your decision makers and stakeholders. Then you're going to build this roadmap. And so what you're seeing here on the left is an example of an actual roadmap or part of one. This is just a portion of one that we created for clients to help them prioritize the recommendations that we presented to them. So you can see we have a priority 1, which is 0 to 6 months. And we go all the way to priority 4, which is 24 to 36 months. And you're just seeing priority 1 and 2 here. This was a big review that we did, and there were a lot of recommendations. So they didn't all fit on a page. So you're just seeing the first 2 priorities. One of the things you should always include in your assessment is a recommendation to do another assessment in some period of time. So the Digital Preservation Coalition, the folks that created the RAM, that worksheet, which is part of the RAM, they recommend you do an assessment every year. We tend to recommend that you do an assessment every 2 or 3 years. And the reason for that is you need time to actually achieve the goals that you've set out for yourself. And we know that things don't happen immediately in any organization. So to say to yourself, here are 10 recommendations, I need to get these done this year so I can do another assessment next year, that just may not be realistic for you. So thinking about things in 3-year cycles might be a more approachable, less intimidating way to handle the growth of your program. So that's why you see our priorities going from 0 to 36 months. But so you'll want to do something like this, because it is unfair to yourself to drop a pile of recommendations and a pile of goals on your lap without sorting them by priority and by what's realistic to do first, second, and third. So for instance, in this roadmap, the first thing we said is establish a dedicated digital preservation advisory group. So spend 6 months, figure out who the right people are, have your first meeting within that 6 months. That's a realistic goal. What isn't a realistic goal in the first 6 months is probably to hire a director of digital preservation. That's going to take much longer. There's so much administration around that. You're going to have to get someone to give you the position. Even a year might be too short, but at least at this point, you can have started on the path to that point by the time you get to that 12-month mark in your roadmap. So I hope you understand the importance of the roadmap for ensuring that you actually are able to implement what you learn from the assessment. Don't be mean to yourself. Be nice to yourself and do a roadmap. That's it. You're done. So what do you do with this when you're done with it? You've gone through, this is a lot of work, and you don't want to, nobody wants to write a report and then watch it get shoved into a drawer. If you create recommendations and a roadmap, you can hang that up on your wall, and that's a real thing that you can refer back to. In the same way, it's a real thing that you can hand off to your administration and your stakeholders and say, this is what we're working on. This is what we're doing to maintain the assets in our collection. And we need you to support this. So for digital staff, you're going to use this document to acknowledge gaps, to use the recommendations to address the gaps, and then of course use the roadmap to prioritize your work. For administration, you can use this report to really push for formal programmatic support. I know so many of us are working on a project to project basis, which just isn't how digital preservation works. Like I've now said many times, it's a maintenance program. It's not a, this year we're getting this money, who knows what next year is going to look like. You need to, as sort of the spokesperson for your digital assets, you need to be telling anyone who can listen that this is a program and needs ongoing support in order to be trustworthy and to ensure the integrity of your files. So this report is one step towards doing that with administration and also with IT. They need to understand that this isn't, you're not asking for just this one-off tool to do something. The work you're doing supports the integrity of your organization. And it is a noble thing. And I'll talk about that in a second. And it's something that you need to communicate as best you can the importance of this throughout the organization. And that's why I say for other stakeholders too, you can use this report to communicate your program successes and your plans for growth and programmatic improvements. And you can use something like this to really develop trust. Hey, look at us, we're professionals, we know what we're doing. You can see that by the work that we've done with this assessment. So how does Digital Preservation Go fit into all of this? Well, Digital Preservation Go, or DPGo for short, is AVP's, what we like to say is your help to take your first next step with digital preservation. So it's a low-cost tool, and we do a lot of the things that we've just talked about that you would do for yourself in a maturity assessment. but we do them in slightly different ways. And part of that is because this is a low-cost tool. And so because of that, some of the onus will be on us to do the work. So your consultant will develop your recommendations and the roadmap for you. You're going to take surveys that reflect that DPC RAM worksheet, will help you to answer the questions so that we can fill that worksheet out for you. And I'll talk about that more specifically as we go. So like I said, DPGo is based on the awesome standards-based work of the Digital Preservation Coalition out of the UK and their rapid assessment model called RAM. And so you can see that's why they have that cute logo of a RAM. So we took the DPC RAM and turned it into a series of surveys that enable us to help you assess your digital preservation program and give you real-world solutions to the challenges you face. The difference between performing the RAM assessment yourself and doing the assessment with AVP is that at the end of our engagement, you'll walk away with recommendations, a roadmap for implementation, and a professional slide deck you can share with your stakeholders and administration. So how does it work? An AVP consultant working in either Spanish or English, so we can do the program in Spanish too if you're a Spanish-speaking organization. We will guide your organization through a process of what we call self-reflection. Then the consultant analyzes and reports back to your organization on your digital preservation maturity, offering, as I said, recommendations and a roadmap for implementation. So the way it works is it's a 2-month-long engagement. The first month, you meet with your AVP consultant for an hour to kick off the project, provide an overview, and answer any logistics questions you have. Then your team completes a number of surveys. There are actually 12, but only 10 are required on a variety of topics as outlined in the DPC RAM that ask questions about your organization's digital preservation maturity. So questions around organizational viability, IT status, financial status, legal status, metadata, data, your objects, how you're formatting your objects, technical infrastructure, organizational infrastructure, all kinds of things that in some way act upon or are acted on by your program. And then starting in the second month, after you've completed the surveys, so you'll have about a month to complete those surveys, your consultant analyzes your results to understand your gaps and your challenges and your successes, and then to also review any questions you had during the survey process. So the surveys have lots of open-ended questions where you can ask your own questions, and you can, oh, this, I can't really say yes or no here, and these are the reasons why. And so the consultant will go in and look at all these questions and try to, synthesize everything you're saying so that we all can get together for a 2-hour workshop to work through any of the responses that maybe didn't make sense, work through any of the questions that you may not have been able to answer, and really just make sure we're all in alignment so that the recommendations we provide you make sense. Then, based on that conversation and your survey responses, we will complete this DPC RAM worksheet. So this is what I showed you earlier. And then we'll draft recommendations and a roadmap, and you'll get it all in a slide deck. I like to say a slick slide deck that you can use to present to administration or whoever you might need to. Recommendations look something like this. This is a real recommendation from a real DPGo assessment. This was one where this organization did not have any policies in place. And again, if you saw me a few weeks ago, you know I love a policy, but so does the international standard for trustworthy digital repositories. So, and that's what we're basing what we know on. And so if you don't have that kind of documentation in your organization and you do the DPGo assessment, you will get a slide like this that says you need to write policy. And then you'll get a roadmap. This looks a lot like the roadmap you saw earlier. This one only had 9 recommendations, but you can see the long-term recommendation was assess your program regularly to ensure continuous improvement. We don't say how often because, as I mentioned, different specialists have different beliefs around that. Again, we say every 2 to 3 years, something like the DPC suggests yearly. So how much does DPGo cost? So we try to be as transparent as we can. DPGo, this particular tool costs $4,000 US. So we feel like that's affordable for a variety of organization sizes and budgets, tends to be under the line that most organizations have to work with to go out to bid. So we try to make it as easy as possible for you to participate if it's something that you want to do. So that's DPGo, but I wanted to tell you, just to give you a very brief overview of some of the other services we provide, and then we'll wrap up the presentation and answer any questions. So these are just a few of our other preservation services. I mentioned earlier that we're also a software development firm, so we can do really magical things with software development too, but that's not what I work on. So I'll talk just about what I do. So we can perform workshops for you. A lot of times people you have a group and they just aren't on the same page about what to do next, or what the vision is, or how to make a decision around a certain issue, or just how to do something. And so we can really help put together workshops that help you with any of those kind of decision-making issues. We do larger scale assessments than the one I outlined here with DPGo. As I mentioned, we can do report writing, we can do those interviews ourselves. With our larger scale assessment tools or services, we will spend between 8 and 12 hours interviewing you and your stakeholders. Those assessments are more expensive, and I'm more than happy to talk about those if you want me to do that in the Q&A session. We also help with technology selection. I'm working on a project right now where I'm helping an organization to select a digital preservation software tool. So that's the kind of thing we can do. We can write RFPs for you. I know nobody wants to write an RFP. I love it. I love writing RFPs. I might be the only person on earth. We can help with vendor management, proposal analysis, anything related to that. And then we do a lot of technology implementation. I'm working with an organization right now to implement LiveSafe. I've worked to implement Preservica. We can do any of that kind of support as well. So I mentioned earlier, soup to nuts. We really do touch on all aspects of digital preservation. But what I'm focused on today is DPGo. And while I'm happy to answer any of the questions around that, I can answer other questions around other services. So this is really my last slide about our services, and that is why a consultant? You are more than welcome, obviously, to do this work on your own. But I think there are some benefits to hiring a consultant, and these are four that I think are the top reasons you might consider it. The first one is you'll get an unbiased analysis. We don't have any emotional attachment to your collections or your organization, so we'll be able to give you honest responses to what we see. We work fast. DPGo, you're done in two months. Most of the work you have to do is done in the first month. So by the end of the second month, you'll have your results. We have experience. I've talked about our experience. And then we're a third party. And for many organizations, third-party voices can often be louder than internal voices. And so, that's just something I've seen over time. And we are happy to be that voice for you if you need us to be. So that's just another value of looking outside the organization. I'm going to wrap up with this slide. Brings us back to the concept of maintenance. Our culture's obsession with innovation and hype has led us to neglect maintenance and maintainers. Digital preservation folks, we are maintainers. There's not a need, but a certain nobility in taking care of what there's not only a need, but a certain nobility in taking care of what you've already created. And maybe we shouldn't look at maintenance as the enemy of innovation. And this is from a great podcast from 2017 called In Praise of Maintenance from Freakonomics. If you've ever listened or read any of those books, they're great. And so I'll just finish by saying I love innovation. It's really, really important. But our job in digital preservation is to grow our maintenance programs. Again, maybe in innovative ways, but we want to focus on nobly taking care of our valuable shared cultural heritage and ensure our records are authentic and persist. Your assessment is the blueprint for rebuilding your road and stewarding your assets today and securing that stewardship for future generations. So there's a link here to get more information on DPGo. You can also email me directly. And I think now we're going to move to Q&A.
Thank you, Amy, for that great presentation. We appreciate everything that you bring to us. And we hope that people have some questions for you. So we'll give them a minute to type it in chat. And while we do that, I have one for you. I noticed on your list of recommendations, the actual ones that you had toward the end of the presentation, there was something about mobilization, and it was about developing a policy on mobilization and whether, and then in parentheses says, or whether not to do it. And that was intriguing because so many times we think that we have to develop policies to do things, but sometimes after we evaluate, the correct response may be not to do it, right?
Exactly. And so that's an important decision. If you're going to migrate something or you're going to normalize your files, you need to document that. But if you decide not to do that, that's a really important piece of information for the next person in your organization, the next person that's you to know when they come in and go, why aren't we migrating anything? They can look at this document and go, oh, an intelligent decision was made and documented. And I may not agree with it, but at least I have a starting point and I know why a decision was made.
Excellent. I don't see anybody have any questions out there? That was a lot of really great information.
Sorry, that's a lot. I see there's a question from Joshua Hackle.
There you go.
Are multiple levels of recommendations based on the cost or resources required to implement them useful, or does that just lead to the cheapest recommendations being implemented? Interesting. I haven't seen that. So my understanding, what I'm reading from this is that if you have recommendations that are, I'm not sure I totally understand this, Joshua. You may have to give me a little more clarification because I don't have any recommendations based on cost or resources required. We don't tend to organize things that way. And if we do, we probably do put them further back in the level in the roadmap so that there is time to find those costs or identify the resources you need to do it. Does that lead to the cheapest recommendations being implemented? Maybe. I haven't necessarily seen that happen. I'll just give you an example. We did this work, not DPGo, but we did a full assessment for Syracuse University with a big long list of recommendations. And one of them was get a digital preservation librarian. And it wasn't in the first priority or even the second priority because we knew it was going to be expensive. It was going to be hard to get that position and to get somebody in. And we made it a third priority, but they did it. They spent the time it took to fight for what they needed and they got it and they were able to hire someone. So I don't think there's a definitive answer to that question. I think it's kind of your organization and kind of making it work within your organization.
Joshua, you can unmute if you want to further that, or if you have other, it answers his question. Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Joshua. That was a great question. Anybody else have anything that you would like to ask Amy while she's here? I think those are a couple of good questions. And I know that was a lot of really good information that we got. So we want to thank you today for being a presenter for us for Shop Talk. And if we can go back to the slides real quick, Amy,
Yep.
since you're sharing.
Let's see. Can you see it?
Yep,
I was
there we
looking at
go.
the recommendations to refer back to what you were asking. There you go.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so thank you guys. And I just want to let you know that in addition, for those of you, we have one more additional shop talk next week on Tuesday. If you guys are interested, and you can go to the website for that. But our other webinars coming up are going to be in beginning in January, what's on tap for COSA in 2022. And then in February, we're going to start talking about preservation at NARA and in Tennessee. So those are going to be exciting. Next. And then we'll be doing the Siri webinars in January, and those will also be good. So next. There's lots of ways to stay in contact with us, and we hope you will use as many as work for you. And again, we want to thank everyone for attending today. Next. And you may or may not get a survey here at the end. If you do, we hope you'll fill it out. And because that helps us as we plan these and go forward. But thank you everyone for attending today. Amy, thank you so much for doing this presentation for us and sharing the information about DPGo and the other services. And we thank everyone for attending, and we'll wish everyone happy holidays. And we hope you all have a great one. Thank you so much. And we'll see you at the next Shop Talk or next COSA member webinar. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.